Hello, 4th and 5th grade. This video is for your Tuesday lesson of Number the Stars. As usual, if you don't have your book in your packet, pause this video and go grab those now. All right, so at the end of the last chapter, or in chapter 9 at least, we're finding out there's this very strange thing going on where they're having this fake funeral for this fake person. A few strangers have arrived to the house and are pretending like they're at this moment of mourning in their living room. And then at the end, Ellen has been reunited with her parents at Uncle Henrik's house. So we're kind of left with this mystery of what is going on here. So before we start reading chapter 10, there are just 3 words I want to go over real quick. So this word is staccato. If you play an instrument, or in the future if you ever learn to play an instrument, this is a musical term, but it has to do with like quick, abrupt sounds. And the way you're going to hear it in the book is it's being used to describe the sound of footsteps. So that kind of, they're just quick, abrupt sounds. So that's staccato. The next word I'm sure you're very familiar with is customs. So customs are just like traditions, so things that you do. So we talked about, even in the last chapter, how it's custom to have this period of mourning when a loved one dies. You can think about holidays. There are different customs that we follow, like Christmas. You go and get a Christmas tree that you decorate with ornaments, and you hang up stockings. At Easter, you decorate and you hide Easter eggs. So these are all customs that are part of our culture. And so depending on your culture, you'll have different customs. Just like, Ellen's family with the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, there are certain customs and traditions that go with that. So just remember that. This last word is typhus, and this is a disease. And obviously with things going on right now, we're pretty used to hearing about these horrible diseases that people can catch. So typhus is a very infectious, contagious disease. It's not really around so much now, but back then it was still very prevalent. But it would have a rash, fever, headache. You'd kind of be a little bit delusional, like not thinking straight. But it was very infectious, and it was something that people had to worry about back then. All right, so keep these words in mind. When you open your books, we're going to be on chapter 10, which is on page 82. Okay. All right, so you follow along as I read. So chapter 10 is called Let Us Open the Casket. Okay, so in this case so far, they have had this casket in the living room. And you know how caskets, they have a lid so that you can see inside. So sometimes caskets can be totally closed. Sometimes like one side might be open so you can see the loved one one last time, you could say. But so the chapter of this is Let Us Open the Casket. So that's kind of a clue we can infer or make an inference that they must have both lids closed on this casket. Okay. You are all here now, Uncle Henrik said, looking around the living room. I must go. Anne-Marie stood in the wide doorway looking in from the hall. The baby slept now, and its mother looked tired. Her husband sat beside her, his arm across her shoulders. The old man's head was still bent. Peter sat alone, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. It was clear that he was deep in thought. On the sofa, Ellen sat between her parents, one hand clasped tightly in her mother's. She looked up at Anne-Marie but didn't smile. Anne-Marie felt a surge of sadness. The bond of their friendship had not broken, but it was as if Ellen had moved now into a different world, the world of her own family and whatever lay ahead for them. The elderly bearded man looked up suddenly as Uncle Henrik prepared to go. God keep you safe, he said in a firm but quiet voice. Henrik nodded. God keep us all safe, he replied. Then he turned and left the room. A moment later, Anne-Marie heard him leave the house. Mama brought the teapot from the kitchen and a tray of cups. Anne-Marie helped her pass the cups around. No one spoke. Anne-Marie, Mama whispered to her in the hall, You may go to bed if you want to. It is very late. Anne-Marie shook her head, but she was tired. She could see that Ellen was too. Her friend's head was leaning on her mother's shoulder, and her eyes closed now and then. Finally, Anne-Marie went to the empty rocking chair in the corner of the living room and curled there with her head against its soft, padded back. She dozed. She was startled from her half-sleep by the sudden sweep of headlights through the sheer curtains and across the room as a car pulled up outside. The car doors slammed. Everyone in the room tensed, but no one spoke. She heard, as if in a reoccurring nightmare, the pounding on the door, and then the heavy, frightening, familiar staccato of boots on the kitchen floor. The woman with the baby gasped and began suddenly to weep. So Anne-Marie is thinking back to that night in her apartment when Ellen first stayed the night, and the soldiers had raided their apartment in the middle of the night. So down here. The male, accented voice from the kitchen was loud. "We have observed," he said, "that an unusual number of people have gathered at this house tonight. What is the explanation?" "There has been a death," Mama's voice replied calmly. So we're on the next page. "It is always our custom to gather and pay our respects when a family member dies. I am sure you are familiar with our customs." One of the officers pushed Mama ahead of him from the kitchen and entered the living room. There were others behind him. They filled the wide doorway. As always, their boots gleamed, their guns, their helmets, all of them gleamed in the candlelight. Anne-Marie watched as the man's eyes moved around the room. He looked for a long time at the casket. Then he moved his gaze, focusing on each person in turn. When his eyes reached her, she looked back at him steadily. "Who died?" he asked harshly. No one answered. They watched Anne-Marie, and she realized that the officer was directing the question at her. Now she knew for certain what Uncle Henrik had meant when he had talked to her in the barn. To be brave came more easily if you knew nothing. She swallowed. "My great-aunt Bertie," she lied in a firm voice. So I'm going to stop there for a minute. So her realization is that if she didn't know anything and just believed the lie that this great-aunt Bertie had died, it would be very easy for her to just say that because it's what she believed to be true. But because she knows it's a lie, it's harder. She has to work up more courage to say it in kind of a steady, certain way. So now she's understanding why her mom and Uncle Henrik had lied to her. Okay. All right, so we're kind of near the bottom of page 84. The officer moved forward suddenly across the room to the casket. He placed one gloved hand on its lid. "Poor great-aunt Bertie," he said in a condescending voice. "I do know your customs," he said, turning his gaze toward Mama, who still stood in the doorway. "And I know it is the custom to pay one's respects by looking your loved one in the face. It seems odd to me that you have closed this coffin up so tightly." His hand was in a fist, and he rubbed it across the edge of the polished lid. "Why is it not open?" he demanded. "Let us open it up and take one last look at Great-Aunt Bertie." Anne-Marie saw Peter across the room stiffen in his chair, lift his chin, and reach slowly with one hand toward his side. Mama walked quickly across the room, directly to the casket and directly to the officer. "You are right," she said. "The doctor said it should be closed because Aunt Bertie died of typhus, and he said that there was a chance the germs would still be there and would still be dangerous. But what does he know? Only a country doctor, and an old man at that. Surely typhus germs wouldn't linger in a dead person. And dear Aunt Bertie, I have been longing to see her face, to kiss her goodbye. Of course we will open the casket. I'm glad you suggested." With a swift motion, the Nazi officer slapped Mama across her face. She staggered backward, and a white mark on her cheek darkened. "You foolish woman," he spat. "To think that we have any interest in seeing the body of your diseased aunt. Open it after we leave," he said. So in other words, her explanation that there was typhus is what killed the aunt. She's saying, she had typhus, but, it's probably fine. But the Nazi let go of his plan to try and open this lid because he doesn't want to get the germs if there are any. All right, so we're at the top of page 86. With one gloved thumb, he pressed a candle flame into darkness. The hot wax spattered the table. "Put all these candles out," he said, "or pull the curtains." Then he strode to the doorway and left the room. Motionless, silent, one hand to her cheek, Mama listened. They all listened as the uniformed men left the house. In a moment, they heard the car doors, the sound of its engine, and finally they heard it drive away. "Mama!" Anne-Marie cried. Her mother shook her head quickly and glanced at the open window, covered only by the sheer curtain. Anne-Marie understood. There might still be soldiers outside, watching, listening. Peter stood and drew the dark curtains across the windows. He relit the extinguished candle. Then he reached for the old Bible that had always been there on the mantel. He opened it quickly and said, "I will read a psalm." His eyes turned to the page he had opened at random and began to read in a strong voice. "Oh, praise the Lord! How good it is to sing psalms to our God! How pleasant to praise him! The Lord is rebuilding Jerusalem. He gathers in the scattered sons of Israel. It is he who heals the broken in spirit and binds up their wounds. He who numbers the stars one by one." Did you catch the title there? Okay. So right here. Mama sat down and listened. Gradually, they each began to relax. Anne-Marie could see the old man across the room, moving his lips as Peter read. He knew the ancient psalm by heart. Anne-Marie didn't. The words were unfamiliar to her, and she tried to listen, tried to understand, tried to forget the war and the Nazis, tried not to cry, tried to be brave. The night breeze moved the dark curtains at the open windows. Outside, she knew, the sky was speckled with stars. How could anyone number them, one by one, as the psalm said? There were too many. The sky was too big. Ellen had said that her mother was frightened of the ocean, that it was too cold and too big. The sky was too, thought Anne-Marie. The whole world was. Too cold, too big, and too cruel. Peter read on in his firm voice, though it was clear he was tired. The long minutes passed. They seemed hours. Finally, still reading, he moved quietly to the window. He closed the Bible and listened to the quiet night. Then he looked around the room. "Now," he said, "it is time." First, he closed the windows. Then he went to the casket and opened the lid. And that's the end of that chapter. So, the Nazi soldiers had noticed that there was this strange gathering of people happening at this home. So they raided the home, and Anne-Marie's family was able to say, "No, we're having a funeral." They were able to prevent the soldiers from looking inside the casket by giving them the typhus story. And then after the soldiers left, just in case there were still soldiers outside, Peter went up and read aloud from the Bible, much like one would like at a church funeral and a church service, so that if anybody was listening, they would think that, yeah, there truly is kind of this funeral service going on right now. Okay, so in your packets today, you are still just working on the quiz time page for chapters 9 through 12. Yesterday you did numbers 1 and 2. Today you're going to do numbers 3 and 4. So number 3 says, "How does Mama keep the soldiers from opening the casket?" So explain what she did. And number 4, what is the meaning of the psalm read at the funeral? So you're going to go back to pages 86 and 87 and just reread the italic words, the psalm, it goes over here, that Peter read aloud. So reread that a few times yourself and see if you can kind of determine some kind of meaning. And maybe think about what Anne Marie's thoughts were as well. Okay? So numbers 3 and 4. All right, thanks.